Hello there. So in this tutorial we're going to be looking at Bootstrap 4, and as part of a series in Bootstrap 4 we're going to be looking at how to organize our folder structure, and we're also going to be looking at how to work with Sass. So if you haven't watched the previous tutorials, I strongly recommend you to watch those first. Also, what I recommend you as well to watch is the Grunt tutorials, because they will get you up to date how to work with Bootstrap 4 and Grunt. However, in this tutorial we're going to do it be different than just working with Grunt. We're going to show you how you also can work with it, and just going to go over quickly how to do it with Grunt. So it's going to be very quick because the other tutorial is explaining that part of it. So let's jump into it. So in a previous tutorial we installed Bootstrap. So you should have something looking like this depending on what package manager you installed it with. You might just have gotten the files from GitHub or something like that. However, the files inside here should be pretty much the same. It should be no different. So with that installed, let's just go over what's in here. So I mentioned in previous tutorials that what's new in Bootstrap 4 is Tether. So Tether is used for your small pop-ups. So depending on whether you're going to use these small tooltip pop-ups, you're going to add that to it as well. And then we've got jQuery, and then we've got Bootstrap itself. So what we're interested in here is obviously Bootstrap. So in a Grunt tutorial we went over how to install Grunt, and just to go over quickly, what's important is you have the Grunt file, you have the package file, and in our package.json file down here, it's what defines the version of Grunt we're going to be installing. So if we go in here, you will notice down here on the dev dependencies that we have one called Grunt. So if you go and say npm install, you'll be installing all these packages here. So that's if you're going to be doing it with Grunt. So just to know what. Also, in the previous tutorial we also mentioned that a new version of Bootstrap is also actually running on a build with Sass rather than less. So obviously we're going to need a Sass compiler, which you got there. One other thing that's worth noting is if you install the package called grunt contrib Sass, pretty sure that's running in a Ruby environment. So if you're going to do that, you're obviously not going to be able to run that just straight off Windows. You're going to need some sort of encapsulated Ruby environment unless you're on Linux or something like that. Then you want to do gem install, etc, etc. So since this is Windows tutorial, we're just going to go on. So the other important file, if you're going to do it with Grunt, is your Grunt file here. So if you open that one, what we're going to find in here is all the tasks. So depending on what packages you installed, if you just installed everything, you should be able to run these tasks. So just go here. We've got the different ones. Just ignore that one for now. So what's worth noting down here is the different ones that's defined. So you'll be able to go Grunt, and there's a default. If you want to run the default one, just do Grunt, or if you run the dist one, then you can do Grunt dist, and so on. So that's how you run them. So one other thing worth noting in here is that you can also do watch. So that package has also been installed. So if you want to just set your watch up and change your file like that, and then get it to compile every time you have made a change. So you can do grunt watch, and it would then be watching that directory. So enough about that. However, if you want to do it with Grunt, don't be worried. The concept I'm going to be showing you here will still apply to Grunt. It's just the basics of how to compile it will be slightly different, but you should be able to follow along just as easy. So let's jump into it. What is worth noting in here is that, as I said in an earlier tutorial, that it's no longer built on less, it's built with Sass. So we've now got a folder called less. So this is all the Sass files, and you notice the underscore in the front. What that means is it's basically a partial, so you won't have a file built from that. So you won't have anything that called, say, normalized CSS in the end. You won't have something called navbar CSS once it's been compiled. It all just partials, which is added into one big document. So you notice down here we got a bootstrap document, and which will then be pulling all these in and then turn into one called bootstrap.min, depending on what's been specified in your grunt file. So that's how that works. So let's just have a look at what's going on inside this bootstrap file. I already got it open here, so let's have a look. So the bootstrap Sass file here, and notice everything, all the Sass file is CSS afterwards. So you know that's your Sass files. So what happens in here is basically pulling all these other files into this one. We're just combining it into this one, and obviously when you're doing that, the order is quite important, because if you have something that overrides it afterwards, obviously that's going to be what's going to be the change in it. So why did I mention that? Well, I mentioned that because we've got one called custom up here. So if we find that one, be in the same folder, one called custom, underscore custom there. And if I open that one, what you notice in here is it says it is what overrides all your variables from your Sass file. Alright? So whatever we type in here is what we override in the variables ones. So what I mean by that is that we obviously have to use the same class if you want to override it. So it should be pretty self-explanatory. So let's just find the variable ones here. So underscore variables. Open that. Now we got a lot of stuff going on in here, and what basically happens in this file is it's pretty much the quickest way you can tweak Bootstrap. So in here you can say I want to change what the gray dark background or whatever that gray dark is used for, or you can change your brand and so on, and you can tweak your grid. You can do a lot of things in here. So depending on what you change each variable to is what's going to happen to your overall design of your Bootstrap project. So what's worth mentioning then? Well, what's worth mentioning is it said what variables we override. So in here, if I was to take this variable and go into the edit to the custom ones here, something like that, and I then was to change it to just change it to black or something like that, this would now be overriding it, and we will now get whatever where this color was used would now be black. Depending on what company you're working for, you're probably going to be doing this differently, because every company will have their own way of doing it. That's not right or wrong, there's industry standards, but at the end of the day, what is most efficient for you, the way to work with it is the right way to work with it for you. And what do I mean by this? Well, while there's a custom file in here, you can change it in here, it's not necessarily the best way of doing it. Personally, I like to take these files out, because if you're going to go into a Bootstrap file in here, you see all these things are added, and I might not want them because I want my site to load quickly. So if I'm not using any of these things, maybe I'm not using the models, or maybe I'm not using process or media or list group or whatever, there's no point in importing them unless you need them, so you can comment them out. But then you run into the problem again, what happens when you go in and operate your project? Does it get overridden, or just make sure not to overridden? If you were going to do it another way and say, if we took these files out, separating from the Bootstrap project itself, having a complete isolated location, then you're certain that you're not going to be overriding these important variables or whatever you changed. Let's do that then. So what we're going to do is, in here, we're now going to take these files we want to use. So I'm interested in using the variables, so we'll take that one. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to go down to the root of my project down here. So I'm going to have my components here. I'm going to create a new one where I'm going to be working with. You can call it anything what you like. You can call it styles or something like that. You can call it or Sass files or something like that. So let's just call that for now. You can just call it styles, whatever suits you. So in here I'm going to copy paste my variables in. So that's going to be my new variables. So whatever changes I want can go in there. What I'm also going to need is go back in here. I'm going to need all this Bootstrap stuff in here. So we open that Bootstrap file down there, because we want to import all these. So I'm just going to copy paste that. Actually, what I'm going to do, I'm just going to copy that file just to make it a bit easier here. So go down there. So you now have that, and I'm going to call that one app. So if you call that one app, this is your app. And you notice that we got an underscore up here, and this is going to be our main one. So this is going to be the file we're going to be compiling. So once we get to working with the compiler. So we now got these. I've got the variables. We're also going to need somewhere we can actually enter our own styles into. So if I just make another copy of this app one, and I'm then going to call this underscore base. So this is where all our own styles are going to go into. So we just open that one up and get rid of it in there. So we now got 3 files: variables, app, and base. And what we then want to do is that we want to take these variables and add them into here. So we want to take a base and add it into that, and so on. However, we also want to compile it somewhere. So say a project here, we're eventually going to have an index file here, and we then want to compile it and output it somewhere. So we want to probably call that CSS or something like that. So I'm going to call it my next directory CSS here. In here is where we're going to add all our CSS. We're also going to need our JavaScript. And so I'm not going to be compiling that. I'm just going to go in and grab it because it's already been compiled in here. So we're going to need jQuery. Just click the minified version there. And you can just go to JavaScript folder there. So we have that there. We're also going to need tether in case you want to use it. So we go into this again. So you can take the minified version there, and then you can take your CSS as well. Now, JavaScript, got tether there. And last but not least, we're also going to need our bootstrap. So we go to bootstrap, and then we find just there. Take the minified version as well there. So I'm doing this because I'm going to be changing them. So instead of referring to the CDN, we're then going to be changing the CDNs to these paths in here. So don't forget to get the CSS as well if you want that. Since I'm not going to be using tether for this one, I'm actually just going to get rid of it for now, just to save us a bit of time here going around. So alright, so we got the CSS folder and we got the JS folder. What we then want to do is we want to output whatever we have in here. So we want to change the app file to take in the base and the variables, and we then want to take everything from our components in here. So we want to go in here, and then we're going to go into there, and then we want to pull these in. So we want to change the path instead of pulling them from in here like this bootstrap file does. We want to then change it from our app to pull it from there, and then compile it, and then output it into a CSS folder. Alright, so let's do that then. If you open up your app file here, you notice that we have variables here. So we still want to put other variables in, but we have our own variables which we want to add up here. And why do we want to do that? Well, you might be questioning that because it's before and not after. So won't that be overridden? No, it won't, because in Sass we got the one called default, and that's basically gonna make sure that whatever we add in front of here is gonna be what's gonna be used. So if you go into your variables CSS file, you notice that all of them are using default here at the end. So let's do that then. If you go back to our app file here, we then want to add our own variables. So we add custom variables up here, and we then want to import them. So we're going to do that by that. So that's going to be the same here because we're now in the same directory. Please note that despite that being an underscore, you don't have to add the underscore, you do it without. So what I mean by that is, you notice here it's got underscore, you don't need to add that there. Alright, so the other thing we're also going to need is, take that, is that we're going to need a base, and we're just going to add that at the bottom here and change that to base. And then underscore base. And that's exactly how you're not meant to do it. So there you go. So we're now pulling this in and this in, and then in our variable file here, what we can go in and do now is we can start to commenting things out, and we can change things and whatever how we want to work with these variables. So for example, I can now change this to black, and if I was going to run this, compile it, that's going to be what goes into our file over here in the app, and that's what's going to be the one that take dominance over this one. So that's how that works. So why are we doing like this? Well, we're doing like this, as I said, because we can just go in and comment things out. So if you've been working on other bootstrap file, you could have gone in and do like that, and we wouldn't get the type. But at the moment, what you notice is that this is not going to work because we're not referencing the right path. So what we need to do is we need to go find the path. So our path is, because we're in here, is we want to go one backward, and then we're going to go in here, and then we're going to go into bootstrap, and then we're going to go in here. So that's the path we want. So what you can do is you can take the path here, just Control C that. To quickly add the path in here in brackets, what you can do is you can use the Alt key, and you can then drag it, doing like that. And if you Control key down as well, you can then mark a new area, so we'll be able to do like this. Just find all of them just in front of there, like that. Scroll down. So JavaScript, everything here, have that as well. There. So these are all the areas we want to type. So if I do a Control V here, just copy paste in what we did before. With all the paths there. Unfortunately, we want to do like this. Just do like that. You could of course also just do a replace here, but I'm just going to do it like this. So that's how you do this. And then in front, as you remember, we want to just go back one, so we just go like that. And that should be all. Yeah. So we're now going into the Sass file, getting all these different files. So you can then save this one. Alright, so once we're done with this, what we need is a Sass compiler. So if you're going to do it with Grunt, obviously you need a task, and you need to probably change the directories a bit just so we can get access to them, so we can compile them. However, since we're doing it differently, we're going to do it root folder here, and we're going to be doing it with something called Koala. And it's quite nice. It's sort of like an easier approach. If you're not so comfortable with the command line tool, it gives you a graphic user interface, and it's pretty easy to set up. So if you go to this address, I'll leave it in the description, and just click download that, and you just follow basically the instruction on how to download. So you should know how to do that now. So once you downloaded it, installed it, let's just go start it up here. If I spell it right, it could. Yeah. So this is what you're going to get introduced to once you start the program. And as I said, it's pretty easy. You got about 3 options here, 3 buttons. So if you click the plus, we're going to add a new project. And I got my project here on the desktop, so if you find that one. So what am I interested in? Well, what I'm interested in is my Sass files in here. So whenever there's any changes to these files, I'm going to compile them. So if I click OK there, what happens now is it's now watching this file in here. You see your app CSS. Let's ignore that. See. Give it a second. Might just be an error in it, like we made a typo or something. But as you see, it's running now. Alright. If I was to go back here, there we are. So it's already created it. It's compiled it. So as soon as you add it in here, it's adding that similar watch function as you see with Grunt. So every time you make a change, it runs and it compiles your project. So what's worth noting over here is if you click on your app, then there's a few options available to it. And if you remember earlier, I mentioned that you need auto prefixes. So if you click that, auto prefixer is gonna target the different browsers and just add a bit extra bit of CSS just to help you with browser compatibility. So you want that on. compiling our pre-processed files. However, it's outputting into the wrong directory. So how do you go about that? Well, there's a couple of ways to deal with it. You can either click on here and you can then right click and you can then change your output path, or you can also click over in project over here and you can then go to project settings, new settings, and then we want to make some new settings for Sass. Say OK to that. It will now open in editor. So in here is the settings for Koala. What we're going to do is we're going to change the mappings. So if you uncomment these in here, so you can do that by doing Control Shift and a / if you just mark them all. I'm just gonna remove them here just because I feel like. So there we are. So we're interested in just keeping the same directory, so we'll be fine just doing that. However, what we are also interested in is actually going out of this directory and going to the previous one. So doing that like that, and then we're going to go into a CSS one. So this is a new path. So if we save that one, now if we then go into Koala again and we then click here, just click the compile just to get it to run. Say success, and then we'll go back in here. We now have this app file in here. So we've got a skating style sheet in there. Open that in brackets, and there we have it. So that's how we're compiling a project. So let's just go in and clean this project up. So we don't want this in here, as we put out before, like that. Keep it a bit tidy. So how do we work with this now? Well, we got Koala running in the background, so every time we're making a change to one of our files, that change would be registered by Koala and it would be compiling and putting into a project file, project folder, sorry. So what we're gonna need now is we're gonna need an index file here, just to sort of demonstrate that it's actually working. So let's create our index file. So we're gonna need a new file. It's cleaned up in here. So we create a new file in here, and we want to make that the index. So if we go to Bootstrap and get it started, and then we just grab this sample stuff here, just copy that, and paste that in there. And in here you notice that we got the paths to the CDN. We then want to change the paths to actually go to a CSS folder. So in here, got CSS, you can take that out there. You've got CSS and Bootstrap, and in our case we decided to call it app. You can change the name, output name, if you want that in Koala as well, if you want to call it main or something there, style, and we're not interested in that one either. No interest in that. So we now got a CSS. Yes, we also want a JavaScript in. So I decided not to bring tether in, but we brought our own version of jQuery. So we can take that one in. So like that, in a JavaScript folder, and we're going to get rid of all this as well. Like that. And similar with the other ones, said we didn't want to get tether, so we're going to get rid of that. However, we do want to bring our bootstrap in. So we've got a bootstrap here. Like that. And as before, just get rid of that. So that should be our main project setup now. So maybe save this one then. Control S if you want. And we want to save that as our index file, and we then want to make that into an HTML file, so .html. And you want to save that in a root, and then make sure you're on all files. Alright, so it changed to up on this HTML now, so that's all good. Now got that in a root. Alright, so if I go to the root of this folder here and I find our index file here and open that on in a browser, what we should see is that it gets all the bootstrap styles that are defined in that Sass file that I pulled in, and there we are. So that's been added to it. One thing you may notice here is that if you remember right, we took our bootstrap.min here. So what would have happened is that it was already compiled, so all the bootstrap things would have gone into there, thus the tooltips would also have gone in. So since we haven't added tether, it should be complaining about that right now. So let's just see. Yeah. So obviously we are missing our tooltips. So you can go take the tooltips out. Just to make it stop complaining here, I'm just gonna add it just for the sake of it. So we can go in here, JS, just get Taylor in here, and then you can go that's your JS folder, and then let's just update it in here as well. So if we just grab this one, like that, and then we just call that Taylor. We should get rid of that error there. Type it right. There we are. Well, that was convenient. So, alright. Let's save that and we refresh this one. See, we got rid of the error there. So that's how that works. We now got our project up running, so we can now start actually playing around with it. So we go into our variables here again. If I was to change anything here, it should compile it and we should see the update there. So we could, for example, change this. We got a header 1 there. We should be able to change that size. And in the previous tutorials, I mentioned how to work with rem. So I'm going to go over that again. It's basically just taking it from the root. So we should have a reduced size now here. And there we go. So it's compiled in the background and updated that file here. So in here we should now see it's now updated in here. So that is how that works and how you can go in and change these variables. Also, what's worth noting is that we had the base file, so if I wanted to add other styles, I can add them in here. Say you don't want to add them in here and clutter up your variables, you want to keep that clean. And as I said, if we didn't want certain things in here, I can go in and take those out. So for example, I just added some styles very quickly here. So these are Sass styles. So you will notice that we got nested styles, and that's what you have with Sass if you haven't worked with it. However, these are not the most pretty styles because I've taken them from previous tutorials on Flex just to demonstrate the exact same thing here. So what we got in here is we got a Flex container, and inside it we got some articles, and inside that we got some articles, and then we adding flex to those as well. So they are defined instead of using block elements, we're using flex. If you don't understand flex, then go have a look at that tutorial. But let's just go into our index file as well. Just click down here. I just added a few here. So we got a container, and then we got our basically our intro, and then we got our flex container here. So you'll notice you don't need this. It's just for you to sort of understand which one is the flex container out of that. So what happens once you enable flex is that it turns all this display block into flex mode. So let's just have a look at how that actually works. How do we turn that flex on? Well, you do that in variables. So if you go in here, you find one that's called enable flex. You see that's enabled to true now. So you can turn that off and on. So enable that, and what will happen now is all your display block will now be using display flex instead. So with that in place, if I was to go and have a look at this page here, let's update it. Now we have the similar one, exactly same actually as the one in our flex tutorial. We got all these children, and they're behaving depending on how we define the flex direction and so on. So as I said in here, our Sass files, that's not a whole lot to it. Your flex container here, as I defined, is just the row, and inside that row we got a bunch of articles, and where there's added a few styles of borders and so on. And then each of these different articles, depending on what number it is, then has a certain color, just differentiated. And then inside the article we have a div, and we just give it a bit of styles, and inside that we then display flex, and we control this children of that. So that's how that works. And then in our index file in here, what you notice is that it's the same as in Bootstrap 3. You got your row and you got your column, and that's how you define it. So you define it by MD3, and that's basically working in intro again. So that would be 4 on a line there. So in here we got 1, 2, 3, 4. And yeah, that's basically it. You go in and you enable that, and then it changes to use the new display flex mode rather than display block, and it's as simple as that. You just change that variable and we can one more thing I just want to mention before we finish off here is that in here where we got a pre-processed files, is that you may notice that it might get quite cluttered having all styles in just one base file. So this is probably the simplest thing you can do now. However, as you work and your project get bigger, or you're working on a large project, it can quickly become very confusing, especially if you have someone who's going to take over your project. So what you will notice a lot of people do is they create subfolders for different parts. So that could be typography, and maybe you want to separate up your buttons or so on. There's a lot of patterns out there for it, so I'm not going to go over them, but I would recommend you to read up on them. So for example, one pattern would be the 7-1 pattern, and that would be that you have one file, for example, and you have 7 directories, and then you have some for pages. So if you have specific page styles, and or you got layout directory and so on. So that's the idea. You separate up your partial files inside these directories, and then you pull it into that one file that is getting compiled by your compiler in the background. So have a read up on that, how to structure it, and hopefully it's given you an idea how to work with it. So you can now go into your base file and start writing your Sass styles out. They will then be added to here. So as I said, have a look at the patterns and go in here in your variables and have a good explore of what actually is in there, because there's a lot of stuff in here that you can quickly change. For example, just to make an example here, is that your brand color is your main color. You can go in and change that. You can change your rounded corners, you can make shadows, and so on. So that's everything for this tutorial, guys. Hope it gave you a pretty good idea of how to work with Bootstrap, and encourage you to get started with it. As it's still in the alpha state, things may change, but the general concept of it should remain the same. So we are pretty late in alpha state, so I doubt there's so much that's going to be changing really. However, don't forget to subscribe and like this video, and hopefully I will see you in the next one. Have a good day, guys. Thank you very much for watching.